Okay.
Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Okay, let's see. Okay, here we go. Yep. So my mom said the title. Thanks everybody for coming. Maybe the title doesn't make so much sense when we start, but hopefully it becomes clear throughout the presentation. And that's going to be the same for this first slide too. I'm sort of going to talk a little bit about the whole project here in the first couple minutes, and then I'll get more in depth about what everything I said means later on in the presentation. So here's a picture many of us can maybe relate to, doing some sort of outdoor recreation, and it could be camping, hiking, biking, skiing. When we think about this type of lifestyle, the environmental impacts we think about are usually localized. We think about erosion on the ground from people walking. We think about trash that can be left behind, which is not so great for animals. But if we clean up after ourselves and we sort of respect the nature, we think that doing these activities, we can leave no trace. That's actually an expression in English. I'm not sure if anyone has heard that, but we call it leave no trace in the wilderness. We clean up our trash and everything's okay. And actually, like I hinted at, we often think that people who engage in these activities really care about the environment and might even be worrying about the natural world with these activities. But I think this story is discounting the global impacts of our actions. So we're using some transportation to bring us to these scenic places to participate in outdoor recreation. And we also have some gear like these tents, backpacks that we use there that were made in a factory in some other country where some emissions were coming out. We call these embodied emissions. So the emissions are embodied in the things that we're using. So whether it's from the tailpipe of our car or from a bus or from a mine or a factory in another country, there's sort of these global impacts that we're not really seeing when we usually think about outdoor recreation. So in this study, I used a survey to investigate transportation use and gear purchasing habits among two groups. One of them was students who are pursuing a degree focused in outdoor recreation at one of 6 Norwegian universities who offer such a degree, and also social media users who frequent groups related to Norwegian outdoor life. They call it friluftsliv. So in this study, I use a hybrid life cycle assessment to estimate that the average participant releases between 3.4 in the social media group and 4.7 in the student group tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions per year in relation to their outdoor recreation. And this is equal to 1/5 of the average Norwegian's yearly greenhouse gas emissions. And by itself, it's actually double the per capita boundary that's required to limit global temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius. In addition to this life cycle assessment, which I'll explain a little more about later, I also performed regression analysis, which is when you take 2 variables and see how well correlated they are, if they're correlated, and how much explanatory power one has over the other. And using regression analysis, I found that personal beliefs and self-evaluated motivating factors did not play a significant role in influencing consumption behavior. And it was much more related to level of disposable income was by far the best predictor of how people would consume and how much environmental impact would then be accrued. So I found that this indicates that the facade of a green lifestyle based on ecological values actually masks the global environmental consequences of excessive consumption related to outdoor recreation. So that's the whole study in a nutshell, but we're going to go through it bit by bit. And I have this thing at the top where we'll go through intro, theory, methods, results, discussion, and conclusion. And we'll try to follow this academic structure of starting with the really general about the topic, consumption and outdoor recreation, sustainable consumption in Norway, global environmental impacts of outdoor recreation. This is looking at previous studies that have been done. Then I'll describe more in detail the hybrid life cycle assessment and the statistical tests I performed, the survey and some limitations before getting into the results, transportation, gear, factors motivating consumption. And then I'll bring back in this other literature that I talked about at the beginning and see how that relates to my results. And then we'll have a review and some questions. Okay. So we know that household consumption is increasing in Norway. I think it was 26% between 1999 and 2012 is the statistic I used in my report. And during this time, household emissions are increasing proportionally. So as expenditure increases, so do emissions. And this is implying that we have no decoupling from consumption and environmental impacts. Of this consumption, household consumption, leisure is 1/4 of all energy use. So previous studies have focused on energy use, and they found outdoor recreation was about 10% of all leisure consumption, both in terms of expenditures and in terms of energy use was the environmental impact metric they were using. In my study, I focused on greenhouse gas emissions. What they found is that in 1 year in Norway as a whole, they were using about 17,000 terajoules of energy for outdoor recreation. And this is actually more than the total energy use of over 30 countries. Many of these countries have populations far greater than Norway. So this means that the average Norwegian for their outdoor recreation is using more energy than people in many countries are using for everything, for their entire lives. And also we know that per hour, 48 megajoules of energy per hour is one of the highest in these other studies. They looked at different forms of consumption, and the only one that had a higher energy use per unit of time was holiday journeys by air. Outdoor recreation was second, and many other things such as spending time in restaurants or even watching movies or using computers had far lower times, around 20 to 25 megajoules per hour. And this is including the emissions embodied in the things we buy. So the transportation and gear we're using for outdoor recreation, we can guess has quite a big impact. But at the same time, outdoor recreation is generally seen as this something that will, if we spend time participating outdoor recreation, we're going to have less environmental problems, especially here in Scandinavia. The government here in Norway is producing advertisements like the one you see on the screen here below on the same page, selling tours to different parts of Norway, very large country, encouraging people from all over the world to come and visit the beautiful nature they have here. And not mention, they're calling it sustainable tourism to green destinations, and not mentioning sort of these environmental impacts that some scholars have pointed to, but actually the vast majority of the literature focusing on outdoor recreation, like this one study I have mentioned here about outdoor recreation and sustainability, they don't talk about the effect that outdoor recreation is having on climate change at all, these greenhouse gas emissions. They talk about how climate change may affect outdoor recreation in the future. How can outdoor recreation be sustainable, as in continue into the future, rather than be sustainable as in be able to be practiced in the future and not harming the environment. So it's sort of a backwards way of what I would think about when I think of sustainability. So we have these different groups who are painting outdoor recreation in a really positive light. And then a couple studies that focused on the general population of Norway and talked about energy use that are sort of hinting at something a little bit darker. So that's sort of what encouraged me to perform this study, where I focused on 2 groups that are expected to have above average interest in outdoor recreation. And I focused on greenhouse gas emissions and what factors were motivating consumption. But before we get into my study, a little bit more on theory. I think that's it for this one. So this image on the left here, on the left of the screen, is one I'm only talking about greenhouse gas emissions. CO2 they call it here, but it's CO2 equivalent emissions. But I find it very nice to use this framing of the planetary boundaries. So of course, in order to get the things we need in society, food, education, democracy, all of these things require some level of energy and material use and entail some amount of emissions. And that's okay. So we want our societies to have all of these things, and we can think about that as the social foundation. But maybe there becomes a certain level of consumption of different things which hits this ecological ceiling, and it's no longer sustainable. So in this study here, they listed some 200 countries in the world on these metrics of both the social foundation and the ecological ceiling. And Norway, perhaps unsurprisingly, similar to the United States and many developed or rich countries, does quite well on the social foundation and very poorly on these ecological boundaries. Other countries have the opposite. They have not reached, they don't have nutrition or sanitation for everyone in society, but they're below this ecological ceiling. So in this study, they actually found no country satisfies both the ecological ceiling and the social foundation. As I mentioned, in this study, we're focusing on CO2 emissions, and Norway has an estimated 17.2 tons of greenhouse gas emissions per person per year. That's what we see in the red line here. That's consumption-based emissions. There's actually two ways of measuring emissions, and one is used by the UN and sort of accepted on the international scale. And that's the blue line here, and it's called territorial emissions. It only includes emissions that take place within Norway. So if I drive my car in Norway, the emissions are counted towards Norway. But if I bought the car, it was imported, built in another country in a factory in Korea, then the emissions from building the car, which took place in the factory, will count towards Korea, not towards Norway. In the red line, the footprint consumption-based emissions, these are included. So we can see in the blue line, it actually looks like the emissions from Norway have decreased in the past 40, 50 years. Whereas if we look at the red line, we actually see an increase in emissions. And the same can be said for a lot of developed countries. We can think about this as outsourcing emissions. So in order to achieve this sustainable consumption, we can think we're going to need some changes at all levels of society. My study is mainly focused on individual consumption, but I think disposable income has increased a lot in Norway. And as long as people have a lot of money and the government is encouraging economic growth, encouraging people to spend that money on something, it's going to often translate into emissions. So I think we do need to look at a more wide scale, not just limiting outdoor recreation, but thinking about how much money is good to be spending on different things in our society, and how much we need to think about conserving for people in other countries or future generations. So we move now to talk a little more specifically about the global impacts of global environmental impacts of outdoor recreation. So first, we'll talk about transportation. That's actually 40% of all emissions in Norway, regardless of type. Transportation accounts for 40% of emissions in Norway. Norwegians actually drive more than any other European country and use public transportation less frequently. Kilometers driven and private car ownership are also both increasing 17 and 20% respectively in the past 10 years. And when we think about emissions from transport, in total, about 55% of that is coming from air transport, 36% is coming from private road transport, and maybe around 4% is coming from public transportation, and 5% from other. Flights in Norway are also above the European average. I think I forgot to mention the other studies which looked at outdoor recreation in Norway. They found outdoor recreation consumption in Norway. They found gear to be more energy use than transportation, but they only looked at single day trips for outdoor recreation. As far as I know, there's no study that looked at multi-day trips for outdoor recreation and looked at what percentage of transportation, what emissions related to transportation that entailed. So I think I was the first one to do that. But as I said, gear was found to be more energy intensive by past studies, and people spend about 3 times as much on average on gear here in Norway as they do in other European countries. The third category that I don't touch on in my study is infrastructure. So it can be a second house, which is really common. People have these, they call them cabins or huttas, a second house in the mountain or by the beach. Most people in Norway, over 50% actually have access to these. And they also have shared communal infrastructure where we stay for outdoor recreation, but I'll leave it at that because we don't focus on these in this study. So now into my methods, a little bit about the hybrid LCA to start. So that involves breaking an activity into different components. I mentioned a few times, mine are transportation and gear. And then we have to think about how we're going to measure those things. So one of them, I used passenger kilometers. So actually the Norwegian government is kind enough to provide information on, depending on which type of transport you're using, how much greenhouse gas emissions per passenger kilometer is being emitted. So I used 4 different transportation types: fossil fuel car, electric car, airplane, and public transportation. And of course, I included trips walking directly from home as well. So in this type of LCA, it's sort of a bottom up. They look at the vehicle and they look at how much emissions are coming from it and give you an average that you can use. And for the other side, for gear, I looked at expenditures, and this actually uses the opposite type of LCA. It's a top-down approach. So they look at all the money that's spent in a society, for example, on different types of outdoor gear. And then they look at flows of material and energy from country to country. and give you, it's called an emission multiplier. So if you can have expenditures in NOK on different types of different categories, it's called KOICOP categories of individual consumption according to purpose. They've been done by the UN. And so I use the categories of clothing, footwear, bicycles, major durables for outdoor recreation, and equipment for sports, camping, and open air recreation. And so I was able to get these different categories and emission multipliers and calculate. I used my survey to calculate the average per person per year, use these prior investigations, and was able to get the total emissions from the observed activities. The second part of the study were the statistical tests. One of them was, they're called t-tests that you perform when you have multiple groups. You see which responses are statistically significant differences between the groups. So I performed t-tests on a lot of the different variables, which will become clearer when we come to the next slide. But I also looked at these dependent and independent variables. So my dependent variables were yearly passenger kilometers traveled for outdoor recreation and yearly that's Norwegian kroner, and 10 Norwegian kroner is basically $1. So I'll remind you of that when we get to some of the tables later on. But so those were my dependent variables. And then my independent variables, I had demographic information. So this could be like age, annual income, years of education. And then I had these self-evaluated motivating factors. So I asked people, what motivates you when you're purchasing gear? What motivates you when you're using different types of transportation? And I had a range of things. So price, time, convenience, you'll see them all later, but people ranked them on a scale of 1 to 5. And it was similar 1 to 5 ranking for these personal beliefs about consumption, which you'll also see the questions I used to get at that later. So these were what I use as my independent variables. So briefly about the survey groups, I posted on 6 groups on Facebook, and also I contacted 6 universities here in Norway that offer bachelor's or master's programs in outdoor recreation, focused on outdoor recreation. And I expected these groups to have high to very high engagement in outdoor recreation, maybe the students higher than the social media group. You can see the population size for both groups, the number of responses. Unfortunately, it's quite difficult to know the response rate for the social media users because I posted on the group's wall and it moves down the wall. So it's impossible to know how many of the total population in the group actually saw the post, but I can estimate it's 0.1% of the population, which is decent for a group size like this. For the student group, if I assume that all the students saw the posts from their professors that shared it for me, I can guess that I got around a 24% response rate and also around 24% of the population. In both cases, these are self-selected samples, so people who chose to take the survey. It's not a truly random sample. That's one limitation of the survey. Another one I mentioned, that infrastructure is not included. Also food systems related to outdoor recreation are beyond the scope of this study. Another limitation is that I used 4 distance categories to estimate kilometers traveled. So less than 50 kilometers from home to cover most daily activity, 50 to 300 kilometers from home for most multi-day activity and most cabin activity, visiting the cabin for outdoor recreation, 300 to 3,000 kilometers from home to cover activity within Europe, and greater than 3,000 kilometers from home to cover activity in the rest of the world. So from these distance categories, I was estimating the kilometers traveled. Also, when it comes to spending, often estimates between, for example, $500 and $1,000 per year, which I will then use estimates across the population to come up with the results. So now into the results. The first thing which we can see, quite a lot of trips per year. Both groups are engaging in outdoor recreation almost every day, but it's not that surprising because almost half of these trips, maybe 40%, are taking place directly from home with biking or walking. So without any motorized transport at all, this could just be going for a walk around your house. And I didn't give this any energy requirement either. But then we can also see around 30% of the trips for both groups were taken using private fossil fuel car. And then we see this difference here where social media users are more likely to use actually electric car than public transportation. And for the students, it's the opposite, which is maybe what we would expect to see. And then both groups traveling by plane between once and twice per year on average. So now we break it down by the distance categories, which I described earlier. So we have less than 50 kilometers, 50 to 300, 300 to 3000, and 3000 plus, and also the average estimated number of passenger kilometers traveled with each mode of transportation within each distance category. So here we see around 40 to 50% of the kilometers traveled in both groups are using private car. And it's actually similar, not so different in both groups in most of the distance categories, except for this one here, 50 to 300 for the student group is quite a bit higher. So this a little bit further from home, maybe single day or multi-day outdoor trip. But we also see now that plane travel accounts for maybe 30% of the kilometers traveled in both groups. So whereas before plane looked so small, now we see it at around 30% of the total kilometers. And we also see a little bit of electric car and public transportation as well. Now we zoom out again and we remove the different types of transportation and we look just at the distance categories. And it's actually quite interesting to me that in almost every distance category, the emissions level are not so different. We see the total here at the end as well. But the emissions close to home, the emissions a little further from home, and the emissions quite far from home are not so different, because it's a shorter trip, but people are taking these trips more frequently. It's a longer trip, but people are taking these trips less often, right? But it's also important to keep in mind that not everyone in the survey reported doing outdoor recreation 300 to 3000 kilometers from home or 3000 plus kilometers from home. Some people in both groups only reported outdoor recreation in these first two categories. So maybe we can imagine those people as emitting around 1000 kilograms or 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions with their transportation for outdoor recreation, and maybe someone who's engaging in outdoor recreation in all of these categories to be emitting significantly more, maybe 5 or 6 tons per person per year. So now we move on from transportation to talk a little bit about gear. And here I'll remind you, 3000 NOK is around $300. So you can just divide by 10. So here we can see, I made some marks here on ones that I thought were particularly interesting. You see the total here at the end, total monetary spending and total kilograms of CO2 equivalent emissions. So actually the highest one for the social media group for emissions was personal mobility, things like bicycle, something that we would all think of as being really environmentally friendly, right? We're going to travel by bicycle. But what I learned this summer is that a lot of Norwegians are actually using electric bicycle. And when we see, also you can see here the percentage of people who spent money in these categories. So when we see 44% of people spent money on personal mobility equipment, and the average spending here as 4,000, we know that the average person spent quite a bit more than 4,000, closer to 8,000, because only half of the people spent money on it, right? So we're including all of that, all of those zeros here in our average as well. That's especially important, I think, when we think about boats and boating gear. So here we see only 16% of people spending money on it, but one of the highest emitting categories, and one of the highest category of spending here for the social media group. Something else that's interesting to me is we have the highest percentage of people spending money on is actually clothing and footwear. So this is maybe something that doesn't relate to camping or hiking or hunting, but just general clothing and footwear to be used outdoors or of an outdoor style. It's really taking a lot of money from a lot of people in both groups. And then also camping and hiking, another category which we're sort of thinking as being not energy or material intensive, is the highest one for the student group, both in terms of expenditure and also emissions. And as I mentioned here, these stars is showing statistically significant differences in how statistically significant they are. So if it's a little bit statistically significant, it means it's how much error we're willing to accept. So if you see 1 star, that means if I tell you that they're different, there's a 10% chance I could be wrong. If there's 2 stars, that means there's a 1% chance I could be wrong. And if there's 3 stars, that means there's a 0.001% chance that I could be wrong about those being different. So here we see personal beliefs about consumption and the environment. So a lot of people, especially students, over 60% of students, they're telling me that the transportation and gear they use does have an impact on global environmental problems. Also around 30% of the social media users. And they're also telling me over 80%, close to 90% in both groups, that it's important for Norwegians to consume less to reduce their environmental impact. So these are examples of personal beliefs about consumption in the environment. But actually, neither of these had any correlation with actual consumption behavior. So how much emissions were being produced was not related to what people were answering in these questions. And that's actually the same for this next graph, these self-evaluated motivating factors. So 5 would be, this motivates me a lot. 1 would be, this doesn't motivate me at all. We can see people ranking different things about how much it motivates them. Time as the most important for transportation among the social media group. Price is more important for transportation among the student group. Safety is very important for both among the gear they're purchasing. But none of these had any correlation with the actual spending behavior, even environmental impacts. So how much are you worrying about environmental impacts when you buy things or when you take some transportation? Students ranked it as more important to them, but actually we remember the student group emitting more on gear and transportation in both categories. Previous studies that looked at consumption in Norway generally assume that time is the most important because of the relatively high levels of disposable income, but we can see here that maybe that depends on the group and also the activity. Whereas gear, maybe time is not the important factor when you're considering what gear to buy, but it is when you're considering where to travel to. So finally, we have the demographic information, which I found to be the best predictor of consumption behavior. I was actually getting a little worried as I was going through all my statistical tests one by one, bivariate regression analysis. Does this correlate with this? Does this correlate with this? And none of them did. When I finally came to these that you see on the right-hand side here, which were the only ones that I found in my study to correlate with consumption behavior. So we can remember the p-value that I described before. That's how tight the correlation is. So we have one on the x-axis and one on the y-axis, and we're drawing a line of best fit. And the better it can explain, as we can see here, the smaller our p-value is. And then we have this r squared, which is telling us about how much the independent variable is explaining for the dependent variable, how much of the variation in one can be explained by the other. So how much can the percent of income we're dedicating to outdoor recreation activities explain how many kilometers we travel each year for outdoor recreation, which is then of course linked to our emissions. With students, you see I only had one metric of disposable income that did correlate. I guess it's quite a bit more difficult to assess disposable income in students since they often receive money from more diverse sources than adults. So I also had some open-ended questions asking people what could motivate them to reduce their consumption for outdoor recreation. You can see some common or interesting answers to some of the questions. For the first question, the answers varied quite a bit from more wild and untouched nature to more managed nature. It seemed like different people had different requirements, but accessing new areas was very important, and also information, people said, could lead them to do more in the local area. For the second question, it seemed like there's this general consensus that private car is cheaper and more convenient way to enjoy nature in Norway. And I think it's important to remember this is the reality on the ground, but it's constructed through political choices. And some responses even hint at this by suggesting more concrete lifestyles, like hinting selling the car or slowing down their everyday life in order to be able to engage in outdoor recreation more around home or more with different types of transport. But I guess what was most interesting to me in these responses was this type of brand and equipment pressure that a lot of people talked about, like having to own a specific type of gear in order to not feel like an amateur. And I think this relates to a lot of the messaging we see in society. So even the government here in Norway, different organizations telling people to engage in this type of lifestyle, that it's good for your health, that it shows how healthy and outdoorsy you are. And then thinking that we need to travel somewhere or buy something in order to fulfill this lifestyle that's sort of been put in front of us. we're getting near to the end now. Moving into the discussion. So talking a little bit about the studies, which we mentioned before. I think I forgot to mention this, actually. The study which I talked about, which talked about the boundaries that we needed to stop transgressing. The boundary for CO2 emissions, they gave a per capita boundary of 1.6 tons or 1,600 kilograms of CO2 per year, CO2 equivalent emissions per year. And we can see even with gear or transportation alone, we're coming close to or surpassing this limit. And when you put them together, they're quite a bit above this limit, more than double this per capita boundary, which is required if we're going to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. There's enough space in our carbon budget for everyone in the world to emit this amount. And if everyone in the world, and if Norway's emitting more than this amount just with their outdoor recreation activity, as I mentioned, it's around 1/5 or a little more than 1/5 of the average Norwegian yearly emissions, which is 17.2 tons per person per year. We can see we have a long way to go. I also mentioned that previous studies found gear to be more impactful, use more energy than transportation. In this study, I found the opposite to be true. This could be because I was focusing on groups that engage more in the activity, or it could be because I used greenhouse gas emissions instead of energy use, but it's likely also due to the fact that the other studies didn't include multi-day travel, and this study did, as I mentioned before. So we can also see how emissions from my group for outdoor recreation compare to emissions from the general population. I mentioned the Amos and Peter study where we saw private car accounting for 36% of emissions. In my group, we see the opposite pattern. Plane is greater than car for the average Norwegian for average travel. In outdoor recreation, it's the car that's being used more. Public transportation around the same for the social media group, but significantly more for the student group. And we also found, like in this transportation study, and also like in this other study, which I have down here that I mentioned before about expenditure increasing proportionally to emissions, we found that wealthier individuals, individuals with higher disposable income, were disproportionately responsible for emissions. So that's the same as the studies before, nothing really surprising there. But I think it really emphasizes the need to reevaluate this narrative we have in society about outdoor recreation as this environmentally friendly practice that's going to promote future care for the environment. As some people travel long distances and buy a lot of gear for outdoor recreation, other people actually are forced to become migrants, refugees from the climate crisis that's being spurred by this consumption. So it really raises questions about, rather than continued growth, maybe finding acceptable limits. And I think, as I mentioned before, it's also important to consider the government who's pushing for more development and value creation from nature here in Norway. Friends of the Earth Norway, a nonprofit group, recently published an article where they describe this Norwegian outdoor life, the changes in Norwegian outdoor life, as a deliberate development, politically steered by the government and its predecessors, turning local nature into playgrounds for the rich. And I would add that with a government actively petitioning citizens with high levels of disposable income, it's unsurprising that we're surpassing these limits of sustainable consumption. So finally, in conclusion, we have 3 main findings which came from the study. The study, again, was a survey which focused on 2 groups, transportation and gear purchasing habits related to outdoor recreation, which factors influence the carbon intensity of these activities. And we found 3.4 to 4.7 tons of greenhouse gas emissions per person per year from the 2 groups. The majority of that, around 65% in both groups, was coming from transportation, and the remaining 35% from gear purchases. Secondly, we found personal beliefs and self-evaluated motivating factors that I described actually had no relation to actual consumption behavior. And instead, we have disposable income as the best predictor of environmental load. I guess I can add finally that I hope this study can reach sort of three groups. There's, of course, the personal. The study is very focused on individuals who wish to reduce their own consumption, but also the social level. So how we talk about things in society, and specifically the academic literature related to outdoor recreation, which I think is really lacking, focusing on local problems and technical managerial solutions, and really ignoring these big issues of how we get to these outdoor places and the things we use there. And finally, the political stage. So governments and organizations who use outdoor recreation to brand themselves as green and nature loving while encouraging these unsustainable lifestyle choices. And finally, I think future support for outdoor recreation should focus on outdoor activities near home that don't rely on specialized technical equipment. Thank you.
Okay, why don't you stop? Yeah, great. So did you want me to call on people, or do you want to call on people for questions, comments?
You can.
Okay, so why don't you use your clever hand raising, the little blue hand, which is under, it's not under reactions, maybe it's under participants. Anyway, you all know how to give a thumbs up or put some, or raise your hand or raise the blue hand or something. Oh yeah, it is there under reactions. It's not blue anymore, it's yellow. Yeah, any comments, questions? Roseanne.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I'm so glad I made time. And I stuck my hand up quickly in case I have to jet off. I had a comment and a question. I just heard an interview on the radio about a person who writes on fashion and said exactly a similar thing to what you're saying, that it is the driving, like your survey respondents, they're saying that they feel the social pressure to get this gear, that it's not coming from them. And yeah, I'll try to remember what the book is, because it was a super interesting comment that in fact it's not that young people really want all that interchangeable, or they think that stuff is fashionable, they feel social pressure, and it's a totally different arena. My question, and I had sort of two, is actually about the gear and the cost as the variable, because I was trying to think whether the footprint of, and I think this is a question you would get, whether the footprint of certain kinds of gear may or may not be related to the cost. Does that make sense? Like a super cheap truck has a different footprint than a very, very, very expensive pair of shoes, kind of thing. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that variable.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for your question and comment. So for that part of the study, as I mentioned, I'm relying on previous investigations. So someone else did a study about consumption in Norway, and they looked at not only outdoor recreation, but all different forms of consumption, how much money was being spent on these different categories of consumption. The UN breaks them down into over 1,000 different categories. And I mentioned the 5 that I use specifically for this study. So they look at energy and material flows and also monetary expenditures, and they line them up on top of each other. It's a much more complicated process than I'm describing. But from what I understand of it, it's called an economically extended input-output analysis. And it's one of 2 forms of life cycle analysis. And so what they do is they create emission multipliers for each one of these categories specific to Norway. So it's they do these studies in different countries, and they use, as I said, data about energy and material flows and economic expenditure, and they come up with these emission multipliers. So I think we can know, the more specific your type of gear is, the less good the resolution is. And it's definitely true that that's a limitation of the study. I would say it's a little bit better for the other side, the transportation. So, but also fuel efficiency ranges a lot in different cars, right? So I'm using an average of what is being bought in Norway. So it doesn't have a high resolution, I think, for each individual person. But when we start looking at large groups and averages, we can sort of start to get a better idea of what's being emitted, I think. But if we were to look at one person buying one piece of gear, you're definitely right. It could be wildly inaccurate, or it could be, you know, far too high or too low. But I think when we get to these sort of higher levels, when we're making the averages from these numbers that may have the less resolution, I think we can get some good results.
Victor.
I don't know if Isaac I don't know if Isaac will also have a question, but since we're
Right.
both here, I have two questions, one kind of bigger and one smaller. Let me start with the smaller one. Having been in the market recently for a car as a good, wealthy consumer, I was trying to understand, life cycle emissions for battery electric vehicles versus, plug-in hybrids versus, internal combustion engine. And it was very confusing, kind of tore through the current literature for me. But one of the conclusions I came to from what I was reading was that there's actually much higher carbon impact of battery electric vehicles than a lot of people assume. And I'm wondering if you factored that in, because of where the batteries are produced, what kind of energy is produced, used for them, and so on, et cetera. And then also what the power source where you charge the car comes from, if it's coming from solar or hydro and so on. So that's one question, if you factored that in. And then the bigger question is, it seems like you're entering into this kind of overall debate about the structural versus the personal responsibility for environmental change, right? That it's really a factor of wealth and consumption, and the reason why wealth and consumption are higher is not because of bad personal choices, or because Norwegians are bad people, even though they have the reputation and perhaps rightly so, as being very environmentally conscious and really into the out of doors, right? So it's not because they're bad people, it's not because they don't care, but rather, and they're trying to make the right choices, but they're unable to because of the structure of consumption in their society. And is that where you're going? And so then the next step from that is that, well, actually this kind of environmental claim for wealthy countries is actually as much BS as sustainable development is BS. Is that where you're headed with this?
Should I take the first question or the second question first?
That's up to you.
Okay. Maybe I'll start with the first one, but you might have to repeat a little bit the second one too. Okay, so the first one, thinking about electric cars, it's very country dependent and also dependent on what you're looking at. So I looked at greenhouse gas emissions in this study. And if you look at greenhouse gas emissions, especially in Norway, so Norway, I didn't mention this, they're 97% hydropower for electricity. So if you're charging your electric car in Norway, it's as close to carbon free as you can be using alternative energy, but it does still have an impact. So another reason I was fortunate that the Norwegian government's providing emission multipliers, for example, for electric vehicles. So I can get a really good estimate for that if you're using an electric vehicle in Norway, what sort of emissions are associated with that. And as I mentioned, they're using hydropower for electricity here, so it's quite a bit lower than maybe many other countries. But the biggest thing I've found with electric vehicles that if we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions, they can perform a lot better than traditional cars. But if we're looking at other factors like acidification caused from mining and processing of lithium for the batteries and these other factors, so that's another reason I thought it's important to mention there's a range of planetary boundaries to consider. And I focus on greenhouse gas emissions in this study, but maybe that's doing a over service to electric cars, making them look particularly good, right? Because I'm not choosing to look at these other factors that could be worse for electric car than for fossil fuel car. In terms of the second question, I would be hesitant to say that people can't make these decisions on their own, like they can't choose to reduce consumption, but also that we need to think about people as a group rather than as individuals. So we can hope that any one individual could have more moral fortitude or think about that and talk about that. But if we're thinking about the majority of people who need to sign up to do something to go along with it, it feels like that's when it really feels like it needs to be a more political, structural changing thing, because it can't just be the people who believe in it who do less of it. But it also, I guess, entails a real restructuring of resource use. So it's sort of a new idea that people in the United States only have a right to so much atmosphere to emit so many tons of CO2 per year. So this is sort of an outlandish statement in a way that I'm taking for granted from my theory section, because it's what science is telling us is necessary, right? So I sort of have that reason to do it. But in terms of how politicians and human society works, there's not really any grounding to make sort of statement like that. Everyone only has a right to emit this much. And but I do think it's something we need to start thinking more seriously about if we really want to tackle the problem, because you can live in Norway and use only electricity and think you're really environmentally friendly and spend a lot of time in nature, and still going to and from the outdoors, you're producing far more than what is allowable for the planet to continue on as it is. So we definitely need more than to count on people to make that change, but I would be hesitant to say individuals are incapable of doing it as an individual, but as a group, we can't expect all the individuals to do it, right? I'm not sure if that answered the question.
To jump back to the battery thing, it's all the other point was that it's where the batteries are made. So if you, like, a lot of German batteries are made using coal-fired electricity, and so those batteries have a higher carbon impact than a battery made, say, in Nevada by Tesla, where they're using a lot of hydro, right? So that, you know, that they might have other environmental impacts, but that of the carbon intensity is different. Or if it's made in China with high carbon inputs, right? So each individual battery is different. So you can't like generalize over electric cars. I guess you maybe could if you know the mix of electric cars or something in Norway and where their batteries come from and the other.
Well, I guess I've never seen any studies that I've seen that definitely makes sense, but I haven't seen any studies that say, even if you're using coal to make the battery, I guess the payback time is 10 years instead of 5, right? Or something like that. But I haven't seen any that say, when looking just at greenhouse gas emissions, given a 20-year life cycle, I haven't seen any that say the electric car is worse in terms of fossil fuel emissions.
Right. But it's not, what the point is it's not that as much better as
much better. Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah. And like I said, it's just, there's so many factors to consider and I guess that brings back to the point that it's less about, of course, what we spend our money on is important, right? Like spending it on transportation versus spending it on something else. The emissions can be different, but as long as we're spending our money on something, there's going to be some environmental impact behind that. So I guess that's sort of my takeaway from it.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bill.
Yeah, thanks, Allianz. That's really interesting. So in terms of the ecological tourism in the United States, one thing you see that kind of makes you feel good is, as you enter state parks, you'll often see a sign that says, leave only footprints, take only memories.
Yeah.
And that sort of tries to make you feel good about what you're doing. Of course, it doesn't mention that you drove your car to get to the park.
Yeah.
I did have a couple questions. So one thing that distinguishes Norway from many other Western European countries is that it's kind of a major oil producer. And I wonder if you think that has had any impact on the way Norwegians deal with, well, outdoor recreation in this case, but ecological things in general. I mean, I guess you could investigate that by looking at doing a similar study in Sweden or something, but I wonder if you have any ideas about how that would go. And then my second question was, this past year and a half or so has been fairly different from most other years. And you didn't mention when your surveys were taken, but I wonder if people are they reporting memories of what they did, or are they reporting what they actually did during the pandemic?
Great. Those two great questions. Thank you. The first one about Norway as an oil producer, I think it definitely has a big impact, but maybe not just because they're an oil producer, maybe because the oil made them so rich. So again, coming back to this idea is that it's not so important what we're spending our money on, but that we're spending it. So because Norway got so much money from the oil, they had the opportunity and chose to develop in a very certain way. Norway has half the population of Sweden, spread out throughout the entire country, whereas Sweden, double the population of Norway, all put in the southern maybe quarter of the country. And the reason for that is the Norwegian government chose to pursue policies from building roads and airports, from giving people money to live in different parts of the country. They decided they want to have the country fully occupied by their small number of residents. And I think the way the infrastructure has been built out and the way Norwegians have been encouraged to like use the whole country definitely has a big role in outdoor recreation. And I think, unfortunately, it's a lot related to anti-Russian propaganda, this idea that if we don't occupy the whole country, that the Russians are going to come and steal it. Actually, I think close to 30% of Norwegians take part in the military and spend a lot of time up in the north looking for Russians. But anyway, that's another story. But so I think the oil did have a lot to do with it, but maybe more in just the GDP in Norway is twice as high. They spend a lot more money on vacations than Swedish people. So I'm sure the study would be a little bit different in Sweden. They also just have this branding of themselves as a country that's so outdoorsy and loving the outdoors. So that could play a role too. And then about the COVID. So for activities around home and near home, I asked people, actually for the ones within 50 kilometers, I asked them in the last month. For the ones 50 to 300 kilometers, I asked in the last 6 months, 300 plus in the last year, 3,000 plus in the last 2 years. And then I did my math to get the yearly average, right? And for the last two categories, I asked them to remember back on the year before COVID. So it would have been, I did this study 7 months ago. So it would have been not the year before, but the year before that they would have been thinking back to.
Justin.
Yeah. First, I just wanted to say that I really liked your presentation of technical material, that especially the kind of statistical analysis, which people often gloss over as either you get it or you don't. And I thought you did a really nice job of for a lay audience explaining what those things are.
Thanks.
On a non-lay audience side, just as a tiny question, I'm curious if you would interpret a little bit more your R squared on the income relationship. But
oh, I think I could do a little bit actually. I could say a little something about it. Or did you have a second part to that question? Sorry.
Not to that question. It's more of a kind of question about framing. I've been thinking of about both what you've said and a lot of other things that I've read. And I was just at a museum that had part of which was about migration. And they had this, kind of didactic thing where it was a little suitcase and then a whole series of things that you could bring with you from home. And of course, not everything fits. And so the question was like, what do you put in? What do you bring with you? And I was thinking about this kind of the ways in which both your respondents understood what were the causes of the or kind of sources of greatest kind of environmental greenhouse gas emissions or what have you, versus an understanding of the choices that they would make if they kind of could frame all of their usage, right? Which I think we don't tend to normally do. So it's more of a comment, but it's one of the things that made me reflect on.
Yeah, definitely. That's interesting. And I think I can talk briefly about the results here, if I can get it to change. Yeah, here we go. So it's both about the p-value and the r-squared. I guess what I thought was kind of interesting about it that I didn't really mention is that when we look at annual income per year, that was the best explainer for how much we're spending on gear. So how much money we have and then how much we're spending. Whereas when we look at how much of that money we have, we're directing towards outdoor recreation activities, that was a little less good at explaining how much we're spending, but better at explaining how many kilometers we're traveling. So it's maybe what we would expect, right? Like how much people are dedicating, what percentage of their lives, of their income they're dedicating to these activities versus just what their annual income is. We could see that being more influential on how much they're spending on gear. So I'm not sure if that's what you had in mind, but in terms of actually interpreting, my understanding is that what the r-squared is showing is what percentage of variation in one can then be explained with movement in the other. So if I move this far in this one, how can I predict the other one will go along with it?
Yeah, or what amount is explained,
Yeah.
like what. So in a sense, then there's a lot of other stuff maybe that's that has explanatory value, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
It's not captured there, and so thinking about what those
Absolutely
might be. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, so 16%, that means that the great percent of this variation in the variable is being explained by something else, right? But something that I didn't get asked them about in my study, or something that, yeah, something else. Oops.
Oh, can you unshare so I can see who else?
Yeah, I did it. I think so.
You had a question.
All right. Okay, first of all, I really like, okay, you did a really good job explaining this for some, like, I don't have to have any context or know any kind of background information to understand what your research was about. And I thought you did a really good job explaining it. And it is like, obviously it's a study focused in Norway, but it certainly makes you think, right? It's a relevant study for almost anywhere. And I think emphasizing that, like, difference between basically global north and global south consumption was good. And I would even maybe highlight that even more, because I thought that part was really interesting. I just had some, like, these are just kind of follow-up broader questions, but I obviously don't have a statistical analysis of this, but just sort of, when you look at gear companies, for instance, or like outdoor recreation companies, they're always selling you on sustainability and, you know, making their products more sustainable, et cetera. So I was wondering if you think that that's maybe a factor as well in how people choose gear, and also like are misled to think that they're not having, you know, that there's something like good for the environment, right? By buying, you know, if I buy gear from Patagonia, that's like good for the environment, right? That's kind of one of Patagonia's messages. And then secondly, I just had a question, like how Norway's natural areas or park system works, because I think a lot about the United States more and more, and how a lot of it is indigenous land that was seized at one time, and now we've converted into national parks for everyone. And there are some sort of proposals floating around about how to maybe give that land back, and what that would look like. And for me, I think that like, I don't know that that would actually reduce any carbon footprints or anything, but it would mean that that land was managed in a very different way all of a sudden, right? If that happens. So just wondering if there's anything like that in Norway, any kind of interesting histories about how that land came to be put aside as natural, you know, natural parks or national natural areas.
Thanks for your comment. I don't know so much about, they're called the Sami people, are the indigenous group in Norway. And I don't know so much about them, but it seems like they're quite a bit better treated than the Native Americans. I think they get a lot of concessions about what they would like to do from the government, and a lot of support from the government. They use a lot of the national park land but I don't think they spend a lot of time there. Like, for example, when reindeers migrate from one area to another through the national parks, they have this policy called every man's right in Norway, or every woman's right, where you're allowed to roam freely throughout the country, basically, even if it's private land, you're supposedly allowed to pass through it, and you're usually allowed to pick berries and allowed to camp anywhere that's 1 kilometer from a building. So they have a lot of progressive, or what we would think of as progressive policies towards outdoor recreation. And I guess that also is a reason why it's become such a big part of the culture. Sorry, I can't remember the first part of the question.
The first one was about like how gear companies, you know, market products as being, like, sustainable and environmentally friendly.
So Patagonia made this really famous ad like 20 years ago, and it was like, it said, "Don't buy this jacket" on the ad or something, sort of getting at this. And of course, for me, it just comes back to some products can be more sustainable than others, and often we tend to think that if they cost more, they can have a more sustainable footprint. But I would think any materials that are being produced, it's impossible for me to imagine it happening without some impact. So even if we're buying sustainable gear, if we're buying it more often, it's less sustainable, I guess.
So it has been exactly 1 hour, and I don't see any other raised hands right now. I think we should end the formal part of the meeting, but if anybody wants to hang out to chat for a couple more minutes, I'm going to stop the recording.